I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a
на полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Like many of history's famous dictators, Augusto Pinochet, Chile's ruler from 1973 to 1990, has many in the world who condemn him to this day. What some may not know, however, is that many in Chile still remember the 1973 coup that Pinochet led with gratitude, seeing his rule as a stabilizing force that averted a communist takeover, ending his predecessor's disastrous economic policies and making Chile today the country with the highest per capita GDP in Latin America. Today we examine this man's history and his legacy.
Hello everyone, I am Alex Nicholson, and today I am joined by Hank Oslo.
Hi.
Adam Smith.
Hello.
And Nick Mason.
Hey.
And today we are going to talk about Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile in the 1970s and 1980s. Pinochet, if you've taken in any of the zeitgeist, was a very controversial character. He was sort of a devil character, especially in the 1990s. We were constantly reminded in the media of his alleged crimes and his, quote, human rights abuses. But, the truth of the matter is that he was a very complicated figure and also a very heroic figure taken as a whole. And so today we're just going to talk about Pinochet and see what conclusions we can come to. And before we get started, I would like to put out a special caveat that none of us are really experts in Latin America or Chile for that matter. We may pronounce some words incorrectly, and we may ignore important historical facts about Chile and the situation. But, we're going to do our best, and we're going to, I would ask you to consider listening to this podcast as us discussing the Pinochet episode rather than us telling you every fact about the Pinochet episode. And we, of course, would welcome any constructive criticism. So, that in mind, is everyone ready to go?
Let's rock and roll.
Yeah,
right.
Let me just throw out there too. If anyone has any personal knowledge about this, any Chileans listening or something, feel free to shoot us an email. Maybe we could do a little recap follow up on it if anyone's interested.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're all American, and so our understanding of Pinochet is a little bit politicized, and it's usually in the context of the Cold War that we're taught about Pinochet and how he was taking the government back from a socialist regime that was leaning communist. And the left or the right has varying degrees of support or criticism for him because of the broader context. But, we don't have any particular opinion necessarily on the man or the ideology. We're just trying to be factual here and try to assess his record as objectively as possible.
Yeah, as people are well aware of the helicopter memes and all of this stuff, and some about Pinochet as if he was in fact an ideological fascist, but he was not an ideological fascist. Let's get that out of the way first.
No, absolutely not. I'll come out and say it right at the front. Like, I am, quote, a fan of Pinochet, but I would say we really should not get overboard in how much we admire the guy, just because his successes were quite bounded at the end of the day.
All right, so why don't you walk us through his background, and then we'll get into what he's most famous for when he became dictator.
Sure. So actually, if you don't mind, I just want to give a very brief, high-level overview of Chile for people.
Sure.
and then get into Pinochet's background. So Chile, as near as I can tell, has stayed approximately 55% white and then roughly 45% mestizo and Indio, with about 10% of that, 10 percentage points of that 45 percentage point number being really Indio, full Indio. Since maybe the mid to late 1800s, it's been roughly that mix. And within the region, it's probably the third whitest country after Uruguay and Argentina. And it is it's a kind of an important country in the region. It really punches above its weight. And so in the late 1800s, 1879 to 1883, Chile fought a successful war against Bolivia and Peru. And in that war, they took the Atacama, they basically took the northern fifth or sixth of what is modern Chile from those two countries. And so that sort of like set the stage for the prestige of the Chilean army. And then following that war, the Chilean army deliberately set out on a course to Prussianize itself. So they brought over Prussian officers and they sent young Chilean officers and Chilean cadets to Berlin to be trained under the German Empire, the Prussian system of military discipline and military theory. Like they studied von Moltke and the other great Prussian military thinkers. And that really had a lasting impact that's still in the Chilean military today. And so it's, from what I can tell, it seems like the military, in particular the army in Chile, is like, it's like the premier institution in the country. It's the most disciplined institution. It's the most, maybe one of the most prestigious institutions. So that's sort of the background that Pinochet is coming from into politics from the army. But yeah, so Pinochet, he's born in 1915. He's from a middle-class background. And so Chile, unlike much of South America, maybe most of South America, it's European and high mestizo enough to have a middle class, which is a kind of an important distinction. And his father was privately an intellectual, but by day he worked as a customs official, and his mother was also an avid reader and like someone who had more than just pedestrian sorts of thoughts. She was a government worker. So he went to Catholic school where he was, in my research, I found that he, quote, was educated by Marxist priests at this Catholic school. So the source that I read didn't go into more detail beyond that, but you can imagine that had an effect on him being exposed to Marxist ideas, at an early age in the 1920s and early 30s. And then he subsequently joined the army, and after a few years in the army was able to get into the Chilean War College and get on a career track that would lead to him being an officer. And at this time he picked up this Prussian ethos of personal discipline, not drinking, not smoking, and really dedicating himself completely to study of warfare, study of history and philosophy, and to doing like a good job as an officer. And what seems to be a key moment in his life was being dispatched to Ecuador in 1956. So at this time, Ecuador was sort of a Chilean ally because they had also annexed land from Peru in the past. So Chile and Ecuador sort of teamed up to make sure the Peruvians wouldn't try to go after any revanchist claims to the land that they'd lost to either party. So he went to Ecuador to set up a war college. But from what I can tell, he actually spent most of his time reading and writing books. So he wrote 5 books, including a book on this great Chilean victory in the War of the Pacific. And then he came back in 1959. And upon coming back, the country had visibly, just in that 3-year period, shifted to the left. And this is a period where Salvador Allende. Am I saying that right, guys? Allende?
Salvador Allende.
That's great.
Yeah, I think Hank got it a little closer, but yeah, same difference.
That's the NPR pronunciation, right?
Yeah, for real NPR, you have to go, the Marxist leader of Chile, Salvador Allende, and then just continue speaking normally as if nothing happened.
Yeah. So this is like a period, while Pinochet was gone, this is a period of like galloping Marxism. So Allende, in 1953, led a very public and high-profile grieving session upon the death of Joseph Stalin, which is sort of an interesting person to mourn.
An odd guy to hang your hat on.
Yeah, I mean, Stalin did some good things, but he did a lot of really bad things too, and just kind of interesting that you would make a big public showing of mourning him. So so Allende was basically working through this 3-year period him and his cronies were working to sort of push the country left with some success. And so Pinochet comes back and is kind of taken aback by how much the country's changed. But instead of sort of dwelling on that, he's not an ideological person. He just doubles down on his Prussian lifestyle and devotes himself completely to his work and is promoted rapidly through the 50s and the 60s, or what was left of the 50s. I guess he came back in 59. So through the 60s, he's promoted rapidly. And he makes brigadier general in, I believe it was 1968. So coming up onto the election. And so that's sort of Pinochet's very high level background. I mean, there's not a lot of sources on his personal life, but I mean, in essence, he's a very talented man, a family man, an intellectual, but not an ideologue. He's not someone who's really interested in ideology all that much, except he has kind of an innate anti-Marxist bent, which, again, the source I read said that he sort of began to become an anti-Marxist while he was running a labor camp before he went to Ecuador. And it's not really explained what was going on at this labor camp. I wasn't able to find the details.
What is a labor camp in Chile? It's like a prisoner camp?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what was going on, but I realize it's not satisfactory to sort of point out this, but that's as far as I was able to go on that thread. But he had some experiences, it seems, that made him an anti-Marxist. And, he's essentially a Latin Prussian sort of. So it's not hard to imagine why he would be opposed to Marxism just on its face.
It's worth pointing out that he was actually he was essentially the last of the main players to join the coup. The Navy was the one that was like pushing for it from the get-go, and he was kind of slow to come around to it.
Yeah, he was a cautious man. He was very pragmatic and careful.
It's just more evidence in line of the we should not be viewing him from an overly ideological lens. His rival, on the other hand, Allende, is another story.
Yes.
Do you want to get into Allende's background a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about him. So Allende is born a few years before Pinochet, 1908. He was influenced greatly by an immigrant Italian anarchist. In the notes I say he's a Marxist. He was actually an anarchist. Maybe that's not a huge distinction, but so this is a guy who's like totally into ideology and ideas. Because he's, as like a 13-year-old, 14-year-old boy hanging out with anarchists. It's sort of a strange thing to do. And he became a medical doctor later in life. And
we should point out that he's from the upper class, the upper strata of Chilean society, which, pretty common amongst what we like to call champagne socialists.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you'll see that a lot. Many of the exiles, the Chilean exiles who later came back and basically took over the country, are from this Champagne socialist sort of background. Do you know about Allende's ethnic background? I know Pinochet was French and Basque, but I don't know about Allende.
Allende was also Basque, and he was some kind of Belgian descent too. I mean, there's a lot of ethnic groups in there, but not sure exactly what part of Belgium. But yeah, I mean, he's the European.
He's a European, okay. So he became Minister of Health in the 30s, and he ran for president like 4 or 5 times. He ran essentially every cycle from 53 to 1970, when he finally won in 1970. He was a member of the Socialist Party, and so the Socialist Party at this point is, we're talking the 50s here, 50s and 60s. The Socialist Party is basically a cover party for the Communist Party, which was outlawed. And you remember, this is a time period after the 30s. It's pretty common to outlaw communist parties. The French outlawed the Communist Party in was it 38 or 39, and so it's pretty common to do that. And Allende ended up getting kicked out of the Socialist Party briefly because he was getting support from this underground communist movement. He was also connected to Marxist death squads in the 60s and 50s who would go around Chile and just arbitrarily murder people who they thought were bourgeoisie.
Do you have any numbers on that?
I wasn't able to get numbers. I think, any numbers you'd see would be pretty broad estimates. But imagine, pretty much small numbers of guys running kind of IRA-style murders against small business owners. That's kind of what's going on.
And what was the public's opinion or reaction to that?
I'm not sure. I mean, this is a period, 53 through 70, it's a period where the Socialist Party is steadily gaining support. They never get a majority, but they're getting more and more support. So I don't know. I mean,
they sympathized with that, or it was divided depending on your class?
Kind of depends. If you're an ideological Marxist, you probably don't mind a small business owner or a factory owner getting shot in the face. But if you're the small business owner's neighbor, or you shop at his store and he's part of your community, you probably don't like it. But the country was never, no country that's ever gone, correct me if I'm wrong, no country that's become communist ever had a majority of people want to be communist. I mean, the Russian Revolution was hijacked. The Chinese Civil War was sort of also hijacked. They used the Japanese to chip away and weaken the nationalist forces.
That's Leninism 101, that the vanguard leads the peasants who are a little bit too dumb to know their own interests into the brave new socialist future.
Right. And so Allende is able to win the presidential election in 1970. So he doesn't actually win 51% of the votes. What he does is he scrapes together 36%. He's able to get a plurality across 6 different parties and have a kind of a tenuous coalition. Coalition of the fringes, you might call it. But it's enough to sort of get him in the door and then start handing out government posts to his allies and doing dirty deals to funnel money to Marxist groups. And he basically undertakes a kind of an illegal and radical push toward a full Stalinist takeover. So they institute price controls. They start seizing and nationalizing factories and mines. And in Chile, the mining sector is a huge it's like their big industry. Mining, they have a lot of copper. And so that's an extremely valuable commodity. They have fantastic copper ore. So, he definitely pissed off a lot of foreign interests in nationalizing the copper mines. And essentially just goes about, destroying the economy. And so by 72, inflation is in the hundreds of % per year. And then in 73, inflation is running 1,000% per year. It's essentially, he's ruined the economy. It's not unfair to say that he's ruined the economy by mid 73.
Why was inflation so high?
Well, I mean, the simple story is, how can you get inflation? You get inflation by two ways. It's a supply and a demand. So you just destroy the supply side, and you destroy the supply side by undermining the business climate and by destroying capital. And you boost the demand side by printing money. I mean, I don't have economic statistics on Chile, but that's how you create inflation. Probably more of it was due to monetary inflation than due to supply side. If you're going to get 1,000%, it's tough to do that anyway, besides excessive monetary base increses.
Was he
Totally
cutting taxes or raising spending? I mean, what was the reason he was printing so much?
Well, he's essentially running a transitionary communist government. So, again, I don't have hard numbers on what the budget was in 1972 in Chile, but you can imagine what he was doing. He was rewarding his allies and punishing his foes by, directing government contracts to, friendly parties, handing out stacks of Chilean pesos to Marxist guerrilla groups and things like that. And he was
It's much easier to do this through monetary inflation than direct taxation every time.
Yeah, I mean, he was spending like crazy, from what I understand. Like, he nationalized a lot of stuff, obviously, but he also made education free to a large number of people, free healthcare, free milk, lots of land seizures and distributions, increases in pensions, electricity subsidies, basically everything that you could spend money on, as far as I can tell.
And what is free education is essentially a code word for funding Marxist ideologues. I mean, that's essentially what's happened in Europe, and to a large extent what's happened in the United States. By promoting education, you're promoting, the worst people in the world.
Well, you're promoting your voter base 20 years down the road.
In Latin America, college is synonymous with Marxism. I mean,
it's in pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, but this is a more out-and-out Marxism.
I think I've heard that too.
I mean, it's like you say, it's like crypto Marxism or cultural Marxism in North America, but I mean they're out-and-out Marxists in Latin America.
Yeah, Latin America is really a very Marxist place. I mean, the church is outwardly Marxist there.
That's where you get liberation theology, for instance.
Yeah, our current pope was one of those believers, followers.
Well, this was a big like the cultural dimensions of this. Now is as good a time as any to bring this up. I'm particularly a big fan of Latin American literature, and you see it in sort of the literary and poetry world. This ideological struggle taking place. For instance, the famed Chilean poet Pablo Neruda was a huge supporter of Allende. And not only that, he was actually involved with the Allende regime. He was one of his advisors. And so part of the romanticism that comes from a figure like Allende is that he had this entire corpus of the literary artistic establishment throughout Latin America sort of, running hagiographical portraits for him. Mm-hmm. And you had, on the other end, you had people like the great Argentine writer John Luis Borges, who is Luis Borges, who is a opponent, of course, of Allende's regime. And tacit, he wasn't a Chilean, but I imagine he was more or less sympathetic to Pinochet. And you see it in other figures too, like the Colombian Gabriel Pérez, who wrote extensively on behalf of Pinochet of Allende, and you can find some of his articles that he did. They were published in places like the New Statesman. And then from then on too, you also had people like Roberto Bolaño, who was a Chilean writer who fled Pinochet's regime after being briefly imprisoned by Pinochet. And he went to Mexico. He was an open Trotskyite Marxist. He's also, actually, in my opinion, a good writer, but that's another story. But my point here is that there's a big cultural to this, like, burgeoning Marxist movement in Latin America, and people were basically taking sides throughout. It was almost like you could say this was an ideological proxy war in Latin America, if that makes sense.
But it's a little bit of a kind of superimposition to say that it's a purely sort of ideological conflict. Like, it's a little bit of an overgeneralization to talk about kind of Latin America as a whole, but you do see these kind of structural aspects where you have kind of a not very strong state apparatus. You have a few very concentrated landlords, landowners, farm owners, mining interest owners, like lots of extractive industries, and like kind of a large peasant population. And that's, you know, if you have like a bunch of peasants that get together and they're pissed off because like they're barely getting paid subsistence wages for, you know, farming rice or whatever, and they start to, you know, demand higher wages, and like, you know, you bring in some goons to crack their skulls, like there's not really a whole lot of ideology going in there. You can frame it in these kind of class conflict terms, and, you know, the kind of more intellectual components on both sides will start kind of draping themselves in these cloaks, like the people who are trying to use the peasants as like sheer meat to seize power are going to like phrase it in terms of like, well, we have this exploited proletariat. And conversely, like, you know, all the landowners, mining interests, etc., are going to frame it as, you know, this incipient Marxist revolution, and like we need authority in order to like crack down on this. But like it kind of it's a little bit too much superstructure, I think, to layer on to like, you know, peasant revolts have been happening for thousands of years.
I agree. I agree completely, Hank, which is why I had some trepidation in my description of it as an ideological proxy war. But the milieu that I was just speaking of was the bourgeois milieu. So it was, you know, these people were thinking about it in those terms, and they did see it as a grand ideological struggle. However, what you're describing is the actual political realities of these countries that have a large population of basically landed peasantry, right?
You guys mentioned revolt, and in this case, if you ask a leftist about Allende, they will often point out that he was, according to at least a documentary or two I've seen on this, the first democratically elected socialist president of a country. And I was a little surprised by that.
That's very important. Yeah, that is an important point.
I don't know.
I think Hitler was a socialist too, so I don't really agree with that statement.
I mean, FDR was essentially a socialist. Yeah. Like it really depends on what you decide that you're going to label as a socialist.
It's more about the red flag, man. Guys, it's about the red flag. That, like, this is in the context of the Cold War, and so the idea was that like Marxism, communism, Marxist-Leninism, whatever you want to call it, does not come democratically to a country. And so it regardless of whether or not we can say unequivocally that this was a true democratic process that brought Allende to power, this was a shocker to people because of that fact that it was expected to come through war, essentially.
I mean, it's like, it's not that he's the first socialist per se, it's that he's the first kind of like socialist in the like communist bloc aligned like politician that comes to power democratically. Like I could see that being
he wasn't a Labor Party or a Social Democrats party. He was pretty openly a hard Leninist, or whatever, Leninist, Stalinist. I mean, we could get into word games here, but he's a dirty commie. That's the point. And he won 36% of the vote, and the way that it shook out, that was enough to form a government.
So you want to get back to your overview, Alex? We kind of were derailing.
Yes, so where were we? We were talking about that 36%. So he wins the election in 1970. And so he proceeds to begin, I think we went over that. We talked about his insane policies. He's running a Marxist program. But one of the interesting things about this is that he went so far so fast before he really had a good grip on power. There's this famous episode where Zhou Enlai, who was one of Mao's deputies, I forget his exact role, he went and visited Allende and warned him when he observed the situation. He warned him that he was going too fast and that he had to slow down and sort of get a grip on power before he really, Mao waited until he had a full communist government until he did the Great Leap Forward. He didn't just launch the Great Leap Forward in 1948 before he'd fully taken control of the country.
Those feels when the Chi-Com have to tell you rammed the dildo in too far.
Yeah, right. It's the crazy thing is that he went so far with only he didn't have a mandate. He had 36% of the vote, and a weak coalition at that. And he had no control over the army. So at this point, I think we need to start to talk about Michael Townley and the CIA role. So when Allende gets into power, and then Nick, I don't know if you're the CIA expert here, please just come in whenever you want to, expand on a point that I might make. But
Sure.
Essentially what they do is they bring in this character, Michael Vernon Townley. So Townley, he's an assassin. He's a murderer. He was born in Iowa, but partially raised in Chile because his father was the head of Ford in Chile, the Ford Motor Corporation. And so at some point he goes back to the US and he's connected to the CIA and he's trained by the CIA in explosives. And so this will be his calling card for the rest of his career. His trick is that he puts explosives into your car, and then when you turn the ignition or when someone's observing you that you're in the car, he triggers the explosives. It's a car bomb. It's a kind of a classic way to assassinate somebody. So he's tied up in a number of car bombings in Miami in the late 60s, and he's working with Cuban exiles to do these things. So he's sent to Chile in 1969 to work with a man named David Atlee Phillips, who is a CIA asset, in order to prevent Allende's election. And so apparently they weren't successful because Allende ended up getting elected, but they did try to recruit a general, a Chilean general, Rene Schneider, who rebuffed them and was then, murdered in public in broad daylight. And it's not clear to me who exactly pulled the trigger to kill Schneider, but it may have actually been Townley, and certainly he was essential in assassinating this guy. So essentially, they were like, "Look, we want you to be, we want you to launch a coup," and he's like, "I don't know if I want to do that," and so they kill him because he knows too much apparently.
Phillips, for the record, was involved with the JM Wave station in Miami, and he had met with. It's largely suspected that he was he was potentially the operative known as Maurice Bishop, who was meeting with Lee Harvey Oswald multiple times before the assassination. So there's a rabbit hole there, but Phillips is a very interesting character.
Mm-hmm. So after Schneider dies, a man named Carlos Prats, and you could think Prats might be a German name. So it's two German surnames in this Chilean army so far. It's interesting. Like they definitely had a lot of German influence in the Chilean army. So Carlos Prats becomes chief of staff of the army, head of the army, and Townley ends up running a smear campaign against Prats because it's determined that Prats will not go ahead with a coup against Allende, who's now in charge. And so he's running the smear campaign against the boss of the army, while he's also building up right-wing death squads in the countryside in Chile, which will be used in the event of a coup. And he's running arson squads in Santiago, which is like this massive capital city where a disproportionate, like a plurality of the population lives, just a huge city. And so he's running like arson squads to basically cause chaos in Santiago. And what ends up happening is that Townley is successful in defaming Prats to the point where he needs to step down. And it's not clear to me what exactly they found. I don't know if he was having an affair, if he was a homosexual, if he was corrupt, whatever it was, he had to step down. And so Pinochet is put into power. So the CIA wanted Pinochet into power, in power. And that's interesting. That's sort of a key thing about this whole episode is that, Pinochet wouldn't have been boss of the army if it weren't for, one, the assassination of Schneider, and two, the defamation of Prats.
And it's worth, as I believe I said earlier, the Navy was like all hands on deck for this. They had some issues with the Army, and that's probably why that guy had to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the CIA must have talked with the Navy beforehand. Obviously, they're talking to everybody in the military infrastructure, and they're concluding the Army is the weak point. They need to get the Army on board and like, hey, this guy Pinochet, he would be good, so let's get him in there.
Well, do you have any evidence to support this? I mean, the famous church hearings, I think, occurred in the 70s, and they were discussing this particular coup in particular. And the CIA, of course, was denying any involvement. That doesn't mean they didn't do anything, but can you lend any evidence? That is a little dated.
Many of the documents weren't declassified until after the church hearings.
So there's documentation that supports Alex's assertion that the CIA was backing Pinochet?
Absolutely.
That's not. I mean, I don't think that's in question at all.
Yeah, there is no question about that.
I'm just asking to make sure we present this right.
You should, but it is the documentation is unquestionably there that and not only that I mean, Kissinger himself was pretty well fingered in this on some level, as well as even Nixon.
Yeah, right.
The debate, the more of it comes when people sort of theorizing that Allende was actually like assassinated or something by maybe a CIA shooter, something like that. But
he allegedly
no real evidence
shot
of that.
himself.
Well, I think it was in 2011 actually that they did some kind of new autopsy and were able to apparently unequivocally find that he shot himself. By the way, the gun that killed him was the AK-47 given to him by Fidel Castro.
Yeah, that's just you could read that so many different ways.
Well, it's poetic.
Exactly.
And I guess we should get into the events of 9/11.
Yeah,
the 9/11. The original 9/11. 9/11, 1973.
So, the coup is on September 11th, 73, but in August 73, it seems that the Chilean parliament actually, like, the situation had become so chaotic that the parliament voted 2/3 to authorize or request, it's not clear, that the military remove Allende from power. So it's not as though this was like a completely undemocratic sort of action, if that matters to you.
Hardly. I'm not like, no, in response to the first part, there was support not only from the de jure legal apparatus of state there, but there was a lot of popular support for Pinochet, or at least rather for the removal of Allende at this point. We can see the evidence of the support for Pinochet when Pinochet eventually steps down and puts his rule to sort of a democratic referendum. He does lose, but he got a similar amount of votes as Allende. In fact, more. He got, because Allende won with 33. So if you want to look at the democratic metrics, you could make a pretty simple case that Pinochet on a certain level was more democratically popular than Allende ever was.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, when did Pinochet win an election?
He didn't win.
So where's the number?
He got 43% of the vote in 1989, and the plebiscite about whether or not he should continue on as a democratic type president.
So at the end of his administration.
And Allende got 36% of the vote to begin with in the 70 election. So Yeah, so the coup, I mean, I don't know that the details, if you guys want to get into the details of the coup,
I just have a few.
But it was like a one-day affair,
visuals.
basically. They just, pardon?
I just have a few visuals in my mind that I'd like to share. Basically, the documentary I saw this in actually many years ago always stuck in my head because it was so ridiculous. I've never seen a fighter jet bomb/fire its missiles at a government building since World War II. Maybe it's happened in Asia, one of those proxy wars, but that happened in, I guess, Santiago. And this was part of the coup. And this is, I guess, shortly before Allende decided to step down and take his own life, if we believe that story. But just the image of a fighter jet strafing the Capitol and launching a missile at the sitting president always stuck with me. So it was a pretty big operation. They had the full military behind this. It wasn't just a little guerrilla operation.
Yeah, and Pinochet was personally commanding or observing the artillery that were shelling, that government palace as well. They weren't just using airstrikes on it. They were, doing artillery strikes as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of romantic, I think, like Pinochet behind the guns, observing the shelling himself. But it was a joke. Like, it took essentially in a day they had more or less taken control of Santiago in one day, and I think that this Allende forces just didn't have. I mean, apparently Allende was building up forces by smuggling weapons in on Cuban diplomatic pouches, and there were KGB agents and Cuban agents in the country. But I mean, the Chilean military.
On the USSR had basically had a weapons shipment that was headed there, and upon the resolution of the events here of 9/11, they redirected it to another country. So there was, I mean, they were being armed by the USSR.
Yeah, it's actually like. There's a good book by Edward Lutlock, Coup d'etat, Practical Handbook.
Oh, that's a great book.
It's a little bit dated right now because of things like the internet and cell phones. At the time, it still described the dynamic very well. I believe it was written in the late 60s, so it predates the coup by a while. But it describes sort of the mechanical aspects of like what you're trying to accomplish in a coup d'etat very well. That you want to have your guys just kind of show up one morning, seize all of the main roads, all of the main lines of communication. You need to get a certain amount of buy-in so that nobody's quite sure who exactly to organize against. And this coup was actually, like, the fact that it was so well executed does, as you were saying earlier, speak to how much Allende really screwed up in not, gutting the at least the top end of the armed forces. Like, usually there's at least some, sort of internal, at least the possibility of internal dissension. Or, alternatively, it's kind of a strong man, like somebody who built up the army as their kind of personal base of support that decides to just kind of formalize their rule. But when you have kind of like an institutional based military that's not just kind of a gang associated with a cult of personality, and you have a successful coup like this, that like really says terrible things about the ability of the civil government in sort of managing the military.
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, essentially what you have is 50,000 or so Prussian soldiers, sort of like Spanish-speaking mestizo Prussian soldiers, if that makes any sense, in a country that's rapidly becoming communist. Like, they just took it over. It was a joke. It was not a problem at all. I mean, the Patton tanks, which is a really iconic tank, I love that tank, were rolling down the street, and what were they using? What were the fighter jets? The one we used in Vietnam.
They looked like they were French or European design.
Oh, okay. Anyway, it wasn't hard. They took the country over, and then they fanned out north to south because that's the only way you fan out in Chile. Do you have something to say?
Well, there's a Hawk. I'm not a big like military tech guy, but there's a Hawker Hunter jet that
would be British, I guess.
Yeah, they had one of these.
Well, there was some support. I think later on, this is from your notes, Alex, but for the Falkland operation on the British side, so the Chileans and Margaret Thatcher were helping each other, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were some sort of weapons sales arrangements with the country established.
Oh, they're using American tanks. They're using patent tanks. They're using.
Yeah, but Hawker Hunter, I believe that's British.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
They're totally Western oriented.
We're gonna just as a preview. We're unquestionably gonna be doing an episode on Peru, and we'll get into Falklands at some point. So we'll save that sidebar a bit for another day.
Oh, I have one more visual to share. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Prussian military in Chile also wears the Prussian helmet, the Stahlhelm. At least at the time
it's that Prussian. Yeah, like the late World War One. What do they call those soldiers?
The bucket helmet?
No. The Stahlhelm, the Wehrmacht style helmet. They came into use at the end of World War One.
I should point out, back to what I was saying, just tied around a little bit about the sort of the culture comp, so to speak, that was happening in Latin America amongst the literati, so to speak. The influence of actual legit fascist and national socialists did have a role on this zeitgeist, as you see with like someone like Roberto Bolaño's book Nazi Literature in the Americas, and it's a common trope that because there were in fact Germans and other Axis power actors who were either they escaped to Argentina or to Chile, or they were even interned in one case. I think the prison camp that you mentioned, or you said labor camp earlier, Alex, are you referring to I think you must be to Pisagua. Well, that was a concentration camp in because Pinochet worked there. And it has sort of an interesting little history to it because it was actually used because Chile had a military dictatorship in the 20s. This camp was used for the internment of homosexuals. And then it has this weird history because first it was used for faggots. And then in the 1940s, it became the wartime internment camp for Axis citizens. And then after that, it was turned into a concentration camp for Chilean communists and anarchists from 47 to 48. And Pinochet was appointed to run it in 48. So there's the
that must be it.
That labor camp. Yeah. Be it. And I just wanted to point out that like these in the culture comp backgrounds, the influence of legit European fascists does exist.
So where are we? We're talking about the fanning out north and south. So after they
What does that mean? I mean, they're marching, or they're using the Navy to kind of do water landings? Go ahead.
So they've taken control of Santiago, and so they send basically mobile infantry, guys with trucks, and helicopter-based troops north and south to sort of round up troublesome people. Pinochet himself had a list of 70 people. So like in the grand scheme of things, 70 people, what's the big deal? It's nothing compared to what Allende would surely have done if he had been able to establish his own dictatorship.
When you're talking about these 70, Alex, because this are you about to talk about the caravan of death here?
Yeah, this is the so-called caravan of death.
Excellent. So before we get into specifically that, I want to comment on about how the counterfactual to that, if the communists had continued to run the country, what would have happened? And we find this in the romantic hagiographical sort of portrayals of somebody like Allende. It's like, oh, this poor peace-loving communist who is, more or less violently deposed. things would have been so great, and then you blame, the aftermath of, you see in the caravan of death. It's like, oh, this is so horrible. A few people are tortured, whatever. But we're never treated to the actual realities of what communists do to their enemies.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not really scientific to say that Allende would have done this. We don't know, but we can only draw from other examples and see if there's a pattern. And I think that's the best way to sort of make the case.
Well, let's talk about Castro and the proportion of his own population that he's slaughtered.
Yeah, I don't know. I would actually pick that part that you say it's not scientific. I mean,
it's the best you can. It's the best you can do. But
I mean, we're using a shorthand. I'm not saying there's a 97% probability that Allende would have killed between 2 and 7% of the population.
But what we know from the amount of, so we know, looking at these kinds of democratic numbers we've been through, we know that the amount of opposition that he had is great. And so in order to solidify his rule and carry out the sort of economic, the socialist, communist rather, economic programs, he would have to use the boot. I mean, it sure as night follows day that there would have been more and more bloodshed. I mean, I see that as a certainty.
Yeah, I mean, like this, we do actually have a fairly large sample size on communist takeovers, attempted takeovers, etc. And it's like, first comes the boot, then comes the famine, then the boot recursively, and then you spiral down into where Venezuela is.
Yeah, I'm looking at inflation numbers. I'm just trying to back up the argument. I'm not trying to undercut it. I just want to have the audience hear as much evidence so that we don't sound like we're coming out of left field here. I'm looking at
right field,
whatever. Well, in this case, it's from the left, right? So, but yeah. Anyway, I'm looking at the inflation numbers for the 70s. Chart doesn't put the time too well, but I'm guessing this is basically when Allende was in power, because there's a precipitous decline around 75, yeah, it looks like
75, 76.
Right, but the inflation rates were atrocious. I mean, it almost went up to 800%, and it peaked probably around 75. So the economic situation was obviously catastrophic.
1,000, I think, was the high cap.
Well, yeah, this chart doesn't show that, but maybe that's.
There's different ways. Number. There's like monthly, annualized. There's year over year.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, once you hit like above like 50% inflation or so, like the number becomes meaningless, because the spread between like what's inflated and what's price controlled, and etc. Like that. The number is no longer a good summary of the underlying dynamic, which is like effectively you need some sort of an in. You need like access to some source of income that's also inflating, or you need to be able to bribe somebody with non-money, or you need barter.
And then you throw in the time dimension. I mean, it's in flux, so at any given point in this process.
So the military fans out and starts grabbing commies.
Yeah, they're grabbing commies. They're grabbing troublemakers. They're bringing them onto boats. They're throwing them out of helicopters. Basically,
wait, is that immediate, or does that come later? Because it's very important we identify the precise moment in which the choppers of freedom begin to descend.
The only thing that I read about helicopters was a very one sentence. They would drug victims and quote victims and throw them out of helicopters. So you weren't even aware that you were being thrown out of a helicopter. You were like on benzodiazepine or something.
That takes most of the fun out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta say that's a little disappointing to me. I guess you don't want him struggling in the helicopter and like causing a potential problem in the helicopter.
How are you you don't want to wrestle someone out of a helicopter.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm saying.
That's fair.
It's just I had in my mind people sort of, I don't know. I guess that's not the.
But anyway, I can't tell you exactly when they were throwing people out of helicopters, but I do know. I think this is actually a bigger dynamic. Is that they had this relatively large, outdated ship that they used for training, that they turned into like a mobile torture ship. So they would go up and down the coast of Chile which is essentially going up and down the country because it's a very narrow country. And they would, move on the local miscreants and then sort of torture them to get some names and then, do whatever they were going to do with them.
This was mostly in 1973, and we got to give credit where credit was due. The pilot, the guy behind this, his name is Sergio Arellano Stark, driver of the Caravan of Death, and he actually recently died at the ripe age of 94.
What did he do?
Is Caravan of Death? I have a feeling that the Pinochet regime did not call it the Caravan of Death.
Probably not.
No,
the Caravan of Justice, like whatever it was.
Caravan of Justice.
Good God! All right, just tell us what it is, though. What happened?
Well,
I don't know what it is.
It was the helicopter-borne communist removal, and it threw about. It's mostly just, like I was saying, mostly in 73. This man who I was just describing, Mr. Stark, was also said to be one of the principal architects behind the events of September 11th, 1973. And he was the one who ran this, and as Alex said, they grabbed commies and they threw them out of helicopters.
How did they identify these people that were deemed enemies of the state?
There are people who were connected with the previous regime. They're the reporters who were shilling for the previous regime. You know who these people are.
Reporters.
Like they had a list, and there's about 75 people, ranging in ages from 16 to 85, and then they also estimate, for the duration of Pinochet's regime, that there are about 3,000 Chileans who went missing. They got lost.
It's not big numbers.
Which does say something nonetheless. Typically there are sort of legal mechanisms to deal with these people after you control the government. Certainly, you can just make it illegal to be a communist and give people your fair trial and then execute them after due process. But the notion of sort of disappearing people that, whatever a plausible South American name, Marcos doesn't come home one night and everybody is just wondering what the hell happened to him. That is a less than desirable sort of mechanism unless you're actually aiming to instill a sense of sort of dread in your population.
I would agree.
Well, and they were, we have to be fair here, there were apparently cases of arbitrary killing where they would go into certain rural communities and kind of kill a few people just to scare everyone. So I'm assuming that these were cases where these communities were known, farming areas were known to be basically Marxist supporting.
Well, it was the North. So the North was the primary Allende stronghold. And from what I can tell, I think the reason that this is some speculation on my part, but I think the reason that they did this, from looking at this, is that it was actually, I think, targeted more for the military itself. That they were, because they perceived that some people, military officers, particularly in this region, the northern mining region, were insufficiently anti-communist. And I think that they were trying to kind of send a message more to the military itself as much as they were to the communist rabble.
Yeah, because immediately after you have a coup, of course, what you have to then worry about is the coup plotters recursively turning on each other. Once you sort of have things like kind of sub-legal death squads running around, there's a real danger that you lose control of that when you no longer have sort of institutions set up to manage these things. And instead it's, somebody discreetly slips somebody else a list of some people and they just suddenly go missing. That's an easy thing, as we've seen with our own experience with the CIA, for that to go haywire.
Mm-hmm.
I should also point, speaking of CIA real quick, I would just point out that this was the Bush CIA at this time.
Under Nixon. Yeah.
Well, under Bush.
No, I know. I'm framing the administration context.
Yeah. Precisely. Yeah.
So there's roughly 3 years of this sort of hard rooting out domestic communists rule in Chile. And then things sort of chill out after that. But it's worth pointing out that there was also a secondary operation because something like 200,000 people left the country within like a few weeks of the coup. And so an organization, DINA, D-I-N-A, has a certain name in Spanish that I won't try to say, was set up to, it's basically the secret police of Chile. And it was set up to both work within Chile, but also to coordinate. This is where the CIA comes in, and Townley comes back into the story.
This is what you call, by the way, Operation Condor. It's the one of the ways to describe it.
It's part of Operation Condor, which is much bigger.
It's much bigger, exactly. Yeah,
that's a CIA operation over the entirety of Latin America or just South America. I'm not sure, but anyway, so DINA, what they do is they basically eliminate like the worst people who escaped. So there's a few famous cases here that are just worth mentioning. Let me look through my notes and see if I can find a few of them. And these will come back to haunt Pinochet.
While he's doing that, does anybody know or want to speculate as to where these 200,000 people left to? Where they went? Cuba?
I mean, they're going to Sweden. They're going to the communist bloc. Yeah. Places like that.
A lot of them fanned out around Latin America. A lot went to Mexico. There was a large Chilean expatriate community in Mexico. I mentioned Roberto Bolaño, the writer, earlier. He was a part of this community.
Yeah, I would imagine they would stay in Spanish-speaking parts of the world.
But, like this period of basically ideological, Hank objected somewhat to the description, and that's fine. But the ideological proxy wars of this period, like they would bounce around from place to place. I mean, for instance, Che Guevara.
That's like that's the elite. I'm just talking the
200,000. No. I mean, like some of the. Well, it depends on what you want to call them. Yeah, but they would bounce around, join various little guerrilla struggles in various parts of the of Latin America, and then move around.
And did they become some sort of influence on these other countries and the broader ideological struggle, as you framed it? That's why I'm asking this. Like, because these exiles, like the Cuban exiles or the
no, they did. They definitely did. I mean, the thing I was pointing to specifically was their influence on the literary scene.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, they were. I mean, it has a very romantic thing, or join the guerrillas or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, in fairness, like, I mean, it's not like there were 200,000 guerrillas.
No, God, no. No.
Most of these guys are like, trade unionists, like left-wing professors, things of that nature, where they're sort of like embedded in the left-wing political structure.
I would argue that's more dangerous than a guerrilla.
Oh, probably, yeah. To the extent that they like have a genuine fear of like oppression by the new regime, probably should be oppressed a little bit. But yeah, I mean they just like screw off to like Mexico City and they become a assistant adjunct professor or something.
Yeah.
The current Chilean president, her father was the what was he? He was the minister of like food distribution under Allende. Like, why do you need a minister?
Michelle Bachelet.
Yeah, her. And so she screwed off to Australia, but apparently Australia wasn't good enough for her. So she moved to the DDR and went to medical school in East Germany.
Okay.
So that'll tell you a little bit about the sorts of people we're talking about here. But anyway, so Carlos Prats, he comes back into the story at this point. Just happens that he died in a car bombing in Buenos Aires in 1974. And then the former vice president, Bernardo Leighton. So it's interesting. These people have Spanish first names and then these just German and Welsh and English surnames. He was shot in Rome. I don't have a date for that, but he was shot in Rome following the coup. And then a famous case, I'm gonna try my best with this name. His name is Orlando Letelier, something like
yeah,
that.
it's Letelier. This is the big one that Townley himself was behind.
Yes, this is huge. So he died in a car bombing in D.C., and this was a big deal because a 25-year-old woman, American woman, I believe, died in the attack. So he was working at a think tank. And what was Letelier's role in Chile? I'm looking through my notes to see that. Do you have that, Nick?
Well, he was the foreign minister.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. So he was working at a think tank, a leftist think tank in D.C., and he was assassinated. And that's kind of like, I don't know, in a really high-profile way. I mean, it wasn't like he, quote, died from a mugging or spontaneously died from a heart attack. It was supposed to be before the CIA had their heart attack gun. Mm-hmm. But he died in like a car bombing. It's like not.
It's pretty conspicuous, actually.
Yeah, the only thing, polonium is probably the only more conspicuous way to assassinate somebody.
And you know, some of the activities, like there's kind of this like trope that's partially for laughs on the right that like, LOL, you just like throw some commies out of helicopters and then things are good. But like, there is a lot of genuinely distasteful stuff going on in Chile. Like the quantity is sort of debatable. There's like this figure thrown around that like, oh well, they only killed maybe a couple thousand people. But there was like a somewhat large amount of various tortures, sadism, rapes, etc. After which you may very well be released. But that's this sort of thing, this kind of like making an example of people that when you sort of lack formal structures around your rule, you're forced to kind of, you know, deploy the boot from the right as opposed to the left.
That's one way to look at it, Hank. But I would point to the CIA's Phoenix program. I mean, these people were trained by the CIA, and you're seeing the same tactics that were used in Vietnam, in which, as much as I do also enjoy the sort of check the commies out of helicopters, not sympathetic to the Vietnam War or what was done to the Vietnamese people by the U.S. military. And so you do see the terrorism, which is what it was, of the Phoenix program being applied to Chile.
However, I'll counter-sigil with you. I'm not a fan of the CIA personally, but the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, you know, were no humanitarians either. So
I don't know. I gotta call bullshit on that, man. Like, yeah, there was some nasty stuff done, but like the North Vietnamese were not just a bunch of ideological communists. They were people. There, yes, those elements existed, but it was just a banner.
Let's stick to this hemisphere for now.
Yeah, sure.
Well,
but my point.
You mentioned the Phoenix program. So how did that have any?
Well, it's the same tactics. It's a counterinsurgency program, and what you see being done that Hank is describing are Phoenix tactics.
And this is the same sort of thing. The Chomsky references always to the School of the Americas, where the United States. I don't know if any Chileans pre-coup were involved with that. I think that was more of an '80s thing.
Yeah, I haven't thought about the School of Americas for a while. Yeah, you know that priest who does like a yearly protest of that?
Yeah, right. And this is where the United States Department of Defense was for the longest time running counterinsurgency training, which included some measure of various counterinsurgency is not pretty at all. Like the way that you defeat counterinsurgencies is not by making people like you; it's by making people terrified of you.
By learning to eat soup with a knife.
Well, right. I mean, we can talk like kind of at a later show maybe about the evolution of U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine, but they like counterinsurgency campaigns that are successful usually involve like a lot of dead people and a lot of terrorized people. So if you're training people in kind of abstracted counterinsurgency tactics, like the way that they frame the School of the Americas as, it's a torture school. But it's not as sort of specific as that. It's like all the terrible things you have to win have to do in order to win a terrible conflict.
Yeah, it's evolved, and it's a complicated subject because it also gets into one of the subjects that I like to talk about a lot, which is the drug trade. And if you look at something like the Los Zetas cartel in Mexico, that has its origins in the same kind of dynamics.
Right. No, we really should do a thing on the Mexican drug war at some point, the Sinaloas versus the
God,
Zetas.
yeah, we have to. It's so important. But since we're doing the Chile thing here, I mean, yeah, you had this was Operation Condor stuff, and it was really like Townley is an interesting character. He actually is still alive, and he lives under witness protection, which is interesting.
Yeah, he essentially got away with murder in a really transparent way. I mean, it was in the press and everything. This isn't like we're going on weird forums or whatever, like getting this from like uncertain sources. This is really, you could just learn all of this from reading old newspapers.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that wasn't the only high-profile murder that Townley was involved in either.
Yeah, he would be in his 70s.
Yeah, I think he's like 76 or something.
Probably, good chance he's still alive.
Oh, he is alive. Well,
we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true.
So basically, by this point, like, it seems like the coup has like worked. Pinochet is like actively in power. He's killed some number of his opponents. He has like a sort of ongoing apparatus to try to secure his rule. What does the sort of interior part of his rule look like?
Yeah, and Milton Friedman too. Throw that in if you can.
Yeah, we will. So they set up a junta government. So junta, I believe, means council in Spanish. Is that correct?
I don't know the exact translation, but I can tell you that a junta is different from a dictatorship in the sense that it is multiple people.
Yeah, so it's nominally a junta. You know, it's the national police, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. Pinochet represents the Army. But in effect, they're more of like an advisory council, and he really wears the pants. And he establishes DINA. They establish pretty harsh at first. They're pretty harsh censorship laws. Like we've said, they're doing all this torture. They're filling the National Stadium in Santiago with prisoners. It's pretty rough. And the economy is still doing pretty badly until roughly 75, when Pinochet. Now, I've read that Pinochet was independently reading Milton Friedman, and then I've read that Milton Friedman was just visiting Santiago because he had some students from Chile. It's not clear exactly what was happening, but Friedman has this 45-minute, 45-minute meeting with Pinochet. I mean, who knows? Maybe it was longer, but Pinochet gets it in his head that, Friedman makes a lot of sense, and Pinochet is a very pragmatic sort of guy. And so they bring back these Chicago boys. These are these University of Chicago trained economists who studied under Friedman. Maybe some of them wrote their thesis under Friedman, but they're PhD economists. And they're essentially, and this is in roughly 75, 76, they're given free rein, more or less, to reform the economy. And, that's what they do. And it works really well. Inflation comes down. Income begins growing rapidly in Chile. And things are basically pretty good. And, this is also a period where the copper price is not particularly high. So it really does seem to be endogenous. Would you like to speak to
what specifically the reforms entailed?
Well, there's sort of different phases, but I mean, the main thing they're doing is they're getting rid of all of these price controls that Allende had put into place, that the Pinochet regime didn't. It's not clear to me exactly like how much reform they did on their own, but essentially
I've also heard that the inflation was brought down through monetary reforms, and they basically they put a strict spending limit on the government based upon their income. So essentially, if they were bringing in 100, they would spend no more than 100, and they weren't printing money essentially anymore.
Now, this is a huge bugaboo of the left, the American left, so to speak.
Specifically?
Naomi Klein is what I have in mind. This
Yeah,
is
but
like,
what are they complaining about?
Well, they connect these torture and physical removal of communists and Milton Friedman.
Yeah, they blame Friedman for that, which is the most ridiculous thing.
Well,
he's like this
Naomi
5'4" Jewish man, and he's like talking about monetary policy, and then they attribute that to.
Hey, Lenin was a 5'4" Jewish man.
Well, this is the key, though. This is the key, though, with the modern left, is that they have to associate fascism, which, by the way, as we established earlier, Pinochet was not an ideological fascist.
No.
But they're going to say that anyways. And they have to associate fascism with capitalism because their worldview just doesn't make sense otherwise. Like, the left cannot handle actually understanding fascism.
Yeah, I mean,
fascism
it's this rhetorical trick where you bundle together like all of the things that you do like. And don't like. Yeah, right. all of the positive things like get like bundled rhetorically with all of the negative things, but of course, like real socialism has never been tried.
Yes, yeah, bingo. And so the Naomi Klein's thesis essentially is that like this was a sort of a capitalist, like American capitalists use, and the CIA and stuff.
Let's not waste our time talking about her yet, because she's just not worth it. She's just really like an intellectual midget. And I feel like she's not even right. If people want to hear about Naomi Klein, there's a Swedish obnoxious libertarian, Johan Norrberg, spelled Norberg, pronounced Norberg. He takes her apart, but she's just not worth it. I really don't want to talk about Klein if we can avoid doing that.
Yeah, that's fine. Suffice to say that this is the Naomi Klein worldview. She has had influence on how the left thinks about this, but yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, we can circle back and talk about it, but let's like prioritize what we talk about.
Go ahead.
So I want to correct something. Pinochet, before the Chicago Boys came down, he did unwind some of the Allende policies. I missed this in my notes. He basically undid the nationalizations that had been done. He returned land and mines to people.
Wait, so Pinochet did or Allende?
Pinochet did.
Right, okay.
Yeah, Allende nationalized a whole bunch of industries as well as the mines and some farmland. Right. So Pinochet undid that. It's not clear to me, and I like sort of a conspiracy, I wouldn't say a theorist, conspiracy hypothesis proposal, that the CIA, one of the reasons they were so helpful is that I have no evidence of this, but it would make sense that some American interests were involved in the copper mines.
Well, the motive exists. I mean, I believe it was 80% of the copper mines were owned by American companies.
Okay, well, there we go.
As I mentioned earlier, Alex, the northern mining region was the stronghold of Allende support.
Yeah, and even absent the mines, like mines need things like big earth-moving equipment, and that's all coming from Caterpillar. They need markets for their copper, and the U.S. is laying a lot of wire. Like telegraph companies buy a lot of copper, and like a lot of those companies are American. So
yeah, I believe the Nixon administration had sanctioned the Allende government economically.
Yeah, make the economy scream.
That's right.
So I'm proposing that a lot of the impetus for this coup, and the reason that the CIA like kind of wanted to get it right, was that powerful American oligarchs, probably connected to the CIA through whatever the nexus is that very rich people connect to the CIA, wanted their mines back. Seems reasonable. I don't know. I don't have direct evidence.
You're not the only one to make that connection.
No, that makes perfect sense when you consider, like, when you throw out the lies that the dynamics of Cold War espionage were based around ideological struggle, which they were not. I mean, there were a few ideological operatives here and there that were genuinely like anti-communists, but for the most part, these things, the ideological dimensions tend to be a cloak for more economic or even domestic political interests.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next.
He also engages in like a lot of pension reforms. Like this is the thing that the present kind of American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, point to as a model for Social Security privatization, which it's debatable whether that could work in an American context, but they essentially switched from state-run pensions to these quasi-private investment accounts, is my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially they run the country like more or less like a neoliberal paradise. They're privatizing much as possible. They have low taxes. They have a reasonably efficient judiciary. The only thing they're missing is, frankly, a lot of Northern Europeans to push them over the human capital threshold.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's and the regime that they established is really still in place in large part. And I almost wonder if the army isn't. We can talk about Chile later, but so there's a very interesting episode that I want to be sure to talk about. In 1982, they start to have an enormous financial crisis, a really bad financial crisis, bad loans. Basically, there's all these stories told about, people who owned the banks were lending money to corporations that they owned, and then the loans went bad. But the key to understanding this crisis that I've not seen anybody get right is that the Chilean peso was pegged to the U.S. dollar. And what happened in 1982? Can anyone tell me? In the United States, Volcker, exactly. Interest rates go way, way high, and the U.S. goes into a deep recession in 82 and 83 before coming out. So essentially what happens is if you have an open capital account, people are able to invest in your country, buy your currency. And if you have a pegged exchange rate, then you do not have sovereign monetary policy. You have to create or buy up Chilean pesos to maintain the peg against the U.S. dollar. In effect, you're using the U.S. dollar just at a different, it's 7-1 or 30-1, whatever it was. So essentially, Chile was running on U.S. monetary policy in a period where the United States needed tight money because we had high inflation, but Chile needed easy money, high monetary growth, because they're recovering from, a socialist regime, and they've got, frankly, like if your goal is just to maximize GDP growth, a really good regime. And so for me, I think that actually explains the episode, but it ends up being kind of a good time for Pinochet to sort of squeeze some corruption out of the country. And he rounds up all these oligarchs who were involved with the banks and were probably doing some shady things. And they do jail time.
Yeah.
Which is really, it's like an Iceland type episode. Right. And they create this gives them a chance to sort of overhaul how banks are regulated in Chile. And, that's sort of its own topic, but it's not that interesting. But
I've heard also prior to that in Latin America, broadly speaking, I would assume Chile is included in this, that a lot of the, I guess they called it developing economies at the time, but there was a lot of money that that the New York banks were taking in from places like Saudi Arabia, as we mentioned before with the petrodollar episode, and putting them into Latin America. And I'm wondering if that was part of the loan crisis that eventually developed later on, Mexico and things like that.
The loan crisis. Almost all debt crises are caused by tight monetary policy, or at least a shift from an unexpected shift to tight monetary policy. So basically what a financial crisis is when people can't pay their debts. And so Chile went into a massive recession, but the people conflate the recession and the debt crisis. I think the debt crisis created the recession. It was the recession, the tight monetary policy, that choked off basically the medium of exchange, the money needed to facilitate economic growth. That caused the recession, and then the businesses, went under hard times, weren't able to pay these business loans back. That's what seems to be what caused the crisis. That's the same case in Thailand. It's the same case in Malaysia. It's the same case in Argentina. It's always tight money. It's usually an exchange rate peg that causes the debt crisis.
It bears mentioning that if you put liberal capitalism hat and you go on heritage, Chile is ranked number 10, top 10 on the Economic Freedom Index, and it's ahead of the United States.
Yeah, those rankings are basically BS.
I
agree with that too.
but you'll see people point to it. I mean, there's
the Fraser Institute also computes economic freedom indices, and they're not the same, but they're like kind of look similar. It's tough to know. I mean, I think like the Heritage Group, I think they're bullshit on the U.S. Like they were anti-Obama, so they put the U.S. down every year Obama was president. Which probably was a bit excessive. But I don't think the indices are completely made up. It's just they distort them with their political bias in specific cases.
Yeah, I'm looking at the economic growth rates in Chile. So in 1982, the economy contracted by almost 15%, which is pretty catastrophic. And then the following year, it went down a further 3%, and then they had a rebound in 84, and when they had a growth of about 7%. And then since then, it's been fairly positive.
Yeah, and they're not dealing with like the best. The impressive thing about Chile is they have copper. That's a good thing to have, but they're not dealing with the best human capital in the world. I mean,
so their exports, the numbers are basically that copper, refined and
wine
and ore represent about half of their exports. The rest is primarily agricultural, which is grapes, wine, fish, and then the remainder is minerals and things like that. So it really is kind of an extractive economy. There's not a whole lot of highly complex economic output coming from the country. So frankly, like if they didn't have the natural resources, they probably wouldn't be as wealthy as they are. Now, the fact that they've managed it and not gone into what is it they call it, the Dutch disease, when they discovered the offshore gas and oil fields in Holland, they went on a spending spree and screwed up their budgets. The fact that they haven't done that, I think they deserve some credit for. But it's like, the Norwegians, they went from one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the richest. And I mean, I think it's fair to say like it was the natural resources that helped them do that.
Yeah. Leftists love to cite Norway because of that.
I should point out it's not just wine though. It's also the delicious pisco liquor, which is kind of like a brandy. I mean, they produce 30 million liters of that like annually. And it's quite good. If no one's had pisco, I recommend getting a bottle of pisco and making pisco sours.
Cool.
Okay, so in 1980, Pinochet establishes a new constitution. And so this is sort of going to help us get to the end of the story here. So the 1980 constitution essentially says that they have to have a plebiscite, basically a vote, yes or no, on continuing the dictatorship. And so that's sort of, I don't know. I mean,
it's sort of a risk. That's interesting.
But it shows that like he's not ruling without like the sort of like some consent of the people here.
Yeah, but I remember when Saddam Hussein won like 99% of the vote too. So if you're a dictator, you can kind of influence the elections. I'm not saying he did that, but when did he do that plebiscite?
But he lost.
Yeah, he lost it. So so what happens is the timeline is 1980 we have a constitution. 1987 they allow political parties to be formed again. And then in October 89 they actually have the vote.
Yeah.
And so Pinochet gets, I think it was 43% of the vote, and he doesn't get to go on. But if he what would have happened was Parliament would have been reinstated, but he would have been president if he had got 51% of that vote. But it didn't work out. So he continued as senator for life. This is a great name, senator for life.
Yeah, they do that in Italy. That's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's back to like immunity from prosecution in a political office. Like that seems to be the function in Italy primarily, and I think that was also the intention in Chile, that just because we voted out this guy, we don't necessarily want to open up old wounds by putting him in front of a tribunal or something.
However, and I'm sure you want to talk about that, Alex, that did happen.
Yes.
So he goes on as senator for life and as head of the army. and a man named these names Patricio Alwyn. So this is again another one of these names, like looks like an Italian name with a Welsh last name. He became president in March 1990 as a center-right Christian Democrat. And then, since 2000, things get bad for Pinochet in about 98, roughly. Hold on just a moment. Let me go to the part of my notes that makes sense to continue upon.
Well, he was brought up on charges in Spain.
Yeah, he starts to get harassed more and more. In 93, this controversy arises over this $3 million payment that may or may not have gone to his son. And essentially what he has to do is put the army on alert and then insist that the investigation be closed. And this is the only instance that I can find of Pinochet being tied up in any sort of corruption. That doesn't mean that there aren't more that I missed, but he doesn't actually seem to have been a very corrupt guy for the level of power that he had. But things start to get bad for him in 98 when he resigns as chief of the army. Starts to get investigated like weekly. And
let that be a lesson to you.
Yeah, he should have.
If you have an army, you probably want to hang on to that.
Yeah. What's that Stalin quote about how many divisions the Pope has? I don't know. Maybe that doesn't apply here. But anyway, so he gets tired of getting harassed every week with these investigations. So he goes on a trip in 1998 to the UK to have a back operation and basically to visit with Margaret Thatcher, who he had helped out during the Falklands War.
That's when they detain him, no?
Yeah.
And yeah, so while he's recuperating, I think it was while he was recuperating in the hospital, he gets a visit from Scotland Yard and he's arrested because someone in Spain is claiming that he killed Spanish nationals. So it's not even like the government of Spain, as far as I can tell. It's like an official in Spain, some Marxist official, post-Franco sort of rat that came out of the woodwork, who's using some sort of human rights law to investigate the guy. And the British are really apparently embarrassed. And they end up delaying the investigation, and he's under house arrest for 500 days with the British are making up excuses for why they can't hand him over.
Typical
Do you
British
think
behavior.
that they would do this to Bush?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like Bush, whatever, come up with some reason that Bush was bad, or the king.
Well, it's kind of funny though, because Bush actually is a war criminal, and second, he has had a Spanish. The reason I draw that parallel too is a Spanish judge has issued basically an arrest warrant for him, something along those lines. I don't know exactly what the technical.
Why is Spain fighting this battle? Are they just bitter that they lost their empire? What's going on here?
They have like this weird property where you can have one of these magistrates. They have a law that essentially gives them universal jurisdiction for quote unquote human rights abuses, and also like magistrates that can allow cases to be brought with like minimal actual parties involved. So basically, you find one like semi-senile left-wing judge, and you can get an arrest warrant against some random minister that theoretically is good throughout the entire European Union.
Right. Good summary, Hank. Yep.
So was there some sort of bigger motivation going on here? I mean, was the New World Order, so to speak, kind of deciding this was this guy's time to go? Because I remember, like, during the, it was 98, 99 or something. I think it was during the end of the Clinton administration. The media was talking about this, and of course they're doing the same thing. They're doing
the news.
They did the same thing they did to Milosevic. It's like, okay, you got another Hitler here. We got to bring him to justice. And that's why I asked, is there a broader influence at play here? Because Spain is sort of a nothing in terms of world power. So I'm curious if they were sort of the front for something larger. I don't know.
I can't tell.
The guy didn't really have much. Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
I was saying I can't tell what was going on, but I mean, Clinton is in power, and this is sort of like Republican dirty laundry from the 70s, maybe, from a discredited administration, in quotes. So no one really wanted to stand up for him, perhaps, but something is clearly going on, and I can't tell what it is.
It just
so there's
strange. They're digging this thing up.
There's kind of been a ongoing campaign since the probably early 90s. I mean, really since the conclusion of the Cold War, by sort of the leftist legal brain trust to try to get this notion of sort of human rights law to be a thing, and to basically make it a universal crime with universal jurisdiction to be not a leftist, essentially, if you're in power. And this has been like a fairly, I don't think there's like a central puppet master. I think there's a lot of kind of forces pushing this from different directions, but this is clearly kind of a thing along with the promotion of things like the notion of like hate speech. Like the legal academy is sort of trying to construct a legal principle by which nothing is in principle outside their grasp.
Bingo, Hank. Exactly right. And in the post 9/11, our 9/11 world, that started to mingle with the whole terrorism, the whole war on terrorism stuff. And I would actually recommend people, like, for a slightly philosophical take, Alain de Benoit wrote a book called Carl Schmitt Today that gets into some of this. It's actually worthwhile. It may be a little overpriced of a book, though, because it's not very big. But yeah, these things merge together. So you have like responsibility to protect, the war on terror, and then these human rights, international human rights stuff. I think
the Anne Marie Slaughter school of thought, or the Anne Applebaum, like the responsibility to protect, like universal, like morality requires that we invade this like shithole company or country and overthrow their government because my universal principles.
Yeah, I totally agree that probably the best explanation for this is about precedent setting for this international beast.
Yeah, basically Pinochet had served his purpose for perfidious Albion, and if we're going to just say all the Anglo-Zionist empire is that, and this was the most useful end that he could be used toward at this point in the late 90s.
Yeah, I think that
wasn't a threat, and hey, we can beat up on this guy now because these people are completely devoid of honor, completely devoid of any long-term thinking, and their goals are not to build a reputation for the United States or for Britain for 400 years in the future. Their goals are, we know what their goals are, right? We don't have to say it out loud and be rude.
This is where we would stick the Zog drop.
Yeah, I mean, their goals are to just destroy, to overturn the legacy, inertia, the order of Western civilization. And so they don't give a shit about, whatever precedent this sets. But I would point out, I mean, why would anybody ever trust America or ever trust Great Britain when this is the thanks that they get? I mean, Great Britain could have easily said, you know what, Spain, you guys were, nothing against our Spanish listeners, but you guys were a big deal in 1600, but you can go to hell, and we're going to put Pinochet onto a big fancy Royal Navy ship, and he's going to go back to Chile in style. You can go to hell. But instead, they played this game of, he's going to be under house arrest for 500 days. It's disgusting.
I mean, he's literally like an old man who had just had surgery.
Yeah.
Well, it's the counterpart too of like we find like the last plausible like Auschwitz accountant or whatever, or like the guy who used to clean their windows, and we charge him with war crimes too.
Yeah, it's the same dynamic. There's no question about that. Because the world order is not just, and they have to make it out like it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have a real shortage of justice, so if they can put on a show of being just, and the average person isn't going to bother to read into Pinochet, then go ahead and do it. But what I wanted to, anyway, so let me just plow ahead here because I have to go, unfortunately. I just want to get through my notes and get through my little thesis that I have. So in 2000, after 500 days of house arrest, Pinochet is finally allowed to go back to Chile. It seems to be because the British were like, look, just pretend you're sick and you're senile and you can't stand trial and we'll let you go back. But miraculously, when he gets back to Chile, he, gets out of his wheelchair and he's like actually like he's fine and like totally, he's old, but like he's still completely with it.
Does a victory lap.
And basically, he just faces 6 years of legal harassment. He's made to do mug shots. He's in Chile because while he was away, the situation had gotten worse for him, and the left had become more powerful. He's forced to undergo fingerprinting, register as a criminal, and it's I think we've largely said it, but it's just a travesty what he's subjected to. And then he dies in 2006, in early 2006, I believe. Was it March?
What did the Economist
December
say
2006.
in their obituary? That's always telling of what the powers that be want the record to state.
I did read it, but I don't recall. I read it at a time. I was a big Economist reader in that period. But.
Yeah.
Adios, mi general.
You beat me to it, Hank.
Undoubtedly, they linked him back to Friedman, who had died only a few months earlier in 2005, which an event I remember well as well. So basically, my final analysis is that like it's sort of tough to be like too enthusiastic about Pinochet in a way, because and I don't want to like ask too much of the guy. I mean, what have I done in my life? I haven't launched a coup and saved hundreds of thousands of people from likely torture and starvation.
Yeah, get it together, man.
Right, but his victory was really limited. Like he didn't. Basically, what he did was he stopped the left from sort of doing what they do, and then he built up this great system and then handed it over to them. Like he didn't fundamentally reform Chilean society. They ended up electing the Socialista Party several times since he relinquished power. And the current president, as I said earlier, what the hell is her name? She's got a French last
Michelle Bachelet.
Yeah, so she's an Allende baby basically. Her father was part of that regime, and she's president right now. And they haven't really changed. They're still running the country in a neoliberal fashion, which I think, honestly, they don't have an immigration problem as far as I know. So that's kind of like, that's fine. I mean, maybe it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. It could be a lot worse. But they didn't fundamentally change Chilean society. Like I keep saying it in the podcast, but like, the effort of the 20th century was to come up with a way to deal with the decline of the medieval order, and fascism, liberalism, communism. This is sort of an Alexander Dugin thesis. Like these are the ways that people tried to deal with it, and none of them were satisfactory.
Fukuyama too. Yeah, it's the standard breakdown.
Yeah, Fukuyama. Yeah, liberalism is this one, and it's like this stable system that's going to last for thousands of years. Like, give me a break.
Right.
Yeah, so, I mean, what was Pinochet? He was kind of just a pragmatic guy who saved his country from communism. That's good. He's a hero. He's a patriot for his people, intellectual, a gentleman.
Well, so the critics will ask, what were the 3,000 people who disappeared and the 30,000 who were tortured or imprisoned? Was that necessary in order for communism to be staved off?
I mean, it's a tough counterfactual. I mean, could they have gotten away with torturing only or killing only 1,000 people? Maybe. But then there'd be 2,000 people who would have been able to take control of the government after Pinochet left. And maybe the government would be even worse today. I mean, in my opinion...
Maybe they didn't do enough.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they didn't... He was sort of constrained by the United States at the time, and yeah, maybe they really should have gone to town and cleaned house. It's tough to say. I mean, like I said, his victory was a bounded victory. I mean, basically what he did was he averted disaster rather than, institute some sort of like truly radical regime that would have given Chile true independence. I mean, it's not an independent country. Very few countries are really independent. What have we got? Like North Korea, China, Russia, maybe Iran. These are independent countries. Israel. But there aren't many independent countries in the world.
Correct.
There are none, actually. I mean, I would say all the ones that you cited, they are dependent on a sponsor nation, essentially. North Korea being China, Israel being the United States. I mean, if you're a small country, you're going to be part of a larger operation, unless you're truly devoid of any value, and then you're just left alone. But
when the tail wags the dog, who's sponsoring who?
Yeah, okay, but we don't need to get into that discussion for now. But
everyone knows about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I just had to say it.
The United States provides the muscle for Israel at a minimum.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I drew from it. I mean, I was sort of like before I looked into it in much detail, I was just kind of a reflexive Pinochet fan, but I kind of see it as more of a tragic episode. Having really thought about it more, because the guy, he was really a failure in a lot of ways, and was in a lot of ways he was. The Chileans, seem to have not been, at least a lot of them, seem to have not been worthy of a man of his caliber, considering the way that he was treated and the way that they allowed the radical left in their country to treat this great savior.
Why do you say he's a failure?
Well, because he died. He didn't have a comfortable, relaxed retirement. Like the left took over the country, and now I don't know what the details are in Chile today, but I have a feeling that the sort of cultural, sort of the SJW type Marxism is pretty strong in Chile today. I'm just going to go out on a limb and propose that that's probably likely. Maybe not economic Marxism, but the left sort of culturally seems to be strong in Chile.
I gotta say, I find it a little bit odd that Pinochet has become such a hero of the new American right. I mean, it's a little bizarre.
I would agree.
Well, there's slim pickings, right? Like you go with the kind of heroes that you have, or that you can create, and there's really only a few like plausibly successful right-wing governments historically.
It's almost like they venerate Pinochet because they don't want to venerate Hitler.
I think that's probably true.
Well, if you want to talk about, I mean, look, some of you may or may not be bigger fans of Hitler than I am, but like Hitler he was a failure. I mean, he cost his country 20 to 30% of its territory, and 6 or 7 million dead men. I mean, shit, compared to Pinochet, that's nothing. I mean, I would, in a sense, I would want to endorse Pinochet more than Hitler, just because he was a true conservative. He was a cautious man and a pragmatist. And maybe he made some mistakes at the end of his life, and maybe he didn't kill enough leftists, but
he didn't have the entire wrath of the Anglo-Zionist empire fall on his
head. But Hitler, I have to leave in literally a few minutes. Hitler courted that by taking Czechoslovakia and insisting on getting Danzig. Hitler could have sat tight.
Well, we'll be doing the great calamity of the 20th century at some point in several parts, so we have plenty to talk about there. But as it stands now, adios, mi general.
Alex, why don't you explain that favorite song of Pinochet's that you wanted to?
Yeah, so the song that I wanted to close the discussion with is a Marlene Dietrich track from 1939. It's Lili Marlene or Lili Marlena, and this is like a famous German World War II song, and it was Pinochet's favorite song, and he had it played at the closing of the ceremony of his retirement. So I'm sure when people hear it, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I've heard this before." It's really a lovely little song. So I hope people enjoy it.
Europa.